Has someone ever tried to make you feel guilty for choosing yourself?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? Because last night, while everyone pretended that family dinner was a truce and not a scoreboard, my dad leaned back with that practiced half smile and called me a burden, and I did not argue or cry or perform anything for the table. I just watched the way everyone pretended to swallow at the same time, took a breath that felt like a door slowly opening, and decided I was done letting people borrow my spine while mocking me for using it. I went in my room without ceremony, because performance is how we prolong nonsense, and I am tired of nonsense, and once the door clicked I did the kinds of quiet things that matter more than any speech. The things that sound small when you describe them but carry the weight of years when you actually do them, which is why I opened my laptop and started with the obvious. Canceling the mortgage top-up that I had set to run on the first of every month back when the pandemic turned their budget into a story about emergencies. Then I signed into the gas and electric and water and turned off the autopays that had my card on file, and after that I removed my card from the phone plan that somehow still had my brother on an extra line. We had it for a month, that became a year, that became a habit, that somehow became my problem. Those screens always ask if you are sure, and I was, which is why I clicked yes, and then yes again, and felt the kind of calm that shows up when you finally stop pretending that being generous and being used are the same decision. And, because calm is contagious, I carried it into the next set of tasks, which meant visiting the 3 credit bureaus and placing a freeze across the board with a pass phrase only I would remember, a phrase that is not a memory but a decision. And when the confirmation emails landed like quiet stamps, I created a single folder called Receipts, because there is nothing more powerful in a family that runs on stories than a clean stack of facts. I wrote one sentence in a note to myself, a sentence that had no poetry and no threat, because poetry feeds a fight and threats invite a dare, and I am done with both, so I wrote this instead: no more rescues. And even reading it now I can feel how that line is not anger but boundary, not vengeance but alignment, and it let me sleep like someone who had finally decided that the person with the wallet also gets a say. Morning came with the kind of quiet that follows fireworks, that moment when your ears are still ringing and everyone pretends they never screamed, and I packed slowly because chaos is their favorite bait and I am not biting. And when I reached the kitchen, my dad was already working through his eggs with the focus of a man who knows how to look busy when the real work is emotional, and I set my bag by the door and said, in a tone you would use to mention the weather to a bank teller, that I had ended every transfer that paid their bills, which is when his fork stopped in midair like a scene cut, while my mom made that concerned sound that is not quite a word and not quite a question, and I added that the utilities were now theirs. The phone plan would bill them directly, and the mortgage would have to stand on its own 2 feet, meaning the same feet they have been standing on while telling me that I should be grateful for the chance to help. He tried to laugh, the way people laugh when they want you to label your boundary as a joke so they can ask you to relax, yet the sound stuck halfway like a zipper with fabric in it, and he said the classic line about family taking care of family. And I told him I had done that for years without making a speech about it, that I did it quietly because I believed this was a bridge and not a permanent road, and that last night he made something very clear without meaning to, which is that I am only useful when I am silent, and I am only valued when I am paying, and if that is family, then I am going to opt out of the premium package. My brother texted from down the hall asking if I could keep his line on for 1 more month while he figured things out, and I replied that adults figure things out with their own names and their own cards, and that I would happily help him navigate a payment plan if he wanted actual advice instead of a handout, which is a message people often hate until they realize it does not contain shame, only the premise that dignity and responsibility are twins. I am not interested in courtroom brawls or dramatic confrontations that end with someone throwing a dish, so I put everything in writing, emailed them simple instructions on how to log into each portal and take ownership, attached the cancellation confirmations for their records, and told them I could walk them through the steps once, on speaker, with a checklist, and then I would be done. And when my mom asked if this was about Christmas, I said no, this is about a story that got too comfortable in my house, a story where I am the cushion, and cushions do not get respect, they get sat on. Before I zipped my bag, I refreshed my email to make sure the final confirmations had landed, and that is when a subject line slid in like a misdelivered letter, cheerful and familiar. Welcoming me back to a store card I have never opened and congratulating me on points for a furniture purchase I never made, with a delivery address that was not mine but rang a bell hard enough to make me sit down and read every line twice. Because if you think ending the transfers was the whole story, wait until you hear where that furniture was delivered and which family name signed for it. By the time the so-called welcome back email finished loading, and I realized that a store card I had never requested was thanking me for purchasing furniture I had never seen, something settled in my chest that felt less like panic and more like that sober kind of clarity you get when the lights come on and the music stops and everyone has to look around and admit where they are. So I took a long breath, clicked through to the account profile, and found an address that matched my parents' street with the apartment number that my brother used while he was supposedly between places, along with a delivery note that said signature on file, which would have been funny if it were not tied to my social and my credit. And instead of running toward a fight with all the heat they expect from me, I made a folder, saved the statements, and told myself that today would be about evidence and choices, not feelings and theater. Group text started like thunder after a summer storm, loud and performative and full of warnings about how I was making a scene over nothing, with my mother asking me not to ruin the holiday afterglow, and my father putting a veneer of patience over a demand by telling me that any confusion about bills could be easily fixed if I would come back to the table and talk like an adult, while my brother, who keeps forgetting that text messages produce a transcript, informed me that phone lines and insurance add-ons were practically free, and it would be petty to remove them during a rough patch, which is the kind of sentence that gives away the entire game because rough patches do not come with store deliveries and loyalty points and confident signatures written in my name. I decided that if everyone wanted to talk in circles, then I would introduce straight lines, so I opened my banking portal, pulled down monthly summaries that showed the mortgage top-ups and the utilities I had carried since the first spring of the pandemic, highlighted the recurring phone plan charge with my brother's line nested under mine like a quiet barnacle, and exported a simple spreadsheet that listed the dates, the amounts written out in words for my own voiceover later, and the notes I had typed in the margin each time someone had promised to switch something into their name and then conveniently lost the login, after which I called Aunt Marjorie because she is the only adult in the family who treats facts like oxygen instead of accusations. And I asked if I could leave a printed packet with her, not because I needed a witness in some dramatic courtroom, but because I understood how fast a story can run through a family when money dries up, and I was intent on staying grounded in what could be printed and signed and filed. When I showed up at her place, she opened the door with that face she makes when she already knows the thing you came to say and is giving you room to say it anyway, and I sat at her kitchen table and talked through the pattern I had been living inside for years without naming it, which is that every time I put a boundary down, someone in my house framed it as an attack, and every time I paid a bill, someone framed it as love, and the day those two definitions fuse is the day a family loses track of the difference between support and control. So I slid the folder across the table and said that I was not asking her to pick sides because sides are for sports and this was my life. I was simply choosing to put proof where gossip usually lives. And she nodded and asked me one question, the kind that goes past the noise and lands where decisions get made, which was whether I was ready for them to be angry longer than I was comfortable, and I told her that comfort had been the bait for years. And I had decided to stop biting. Back at my place, I typed one message to the group that I read out loud to check my tone before I hit send, a message that said I had canceled the transfers that I had set up during an emergency that never ended, that I would no longer be an authorized payer on utilities, that the phone plan would be transferred to their name before the next cycle, and I would remove myself if the transfer did not happen, and that, in the event anyone wanted help navigating customer service, I would make time for a single speakerphone call with a checklist and then step away, and I finished with a line that was harder to write than any of the rest, which said that a store card opened with my social and a delivery made to a family address would be handled in writing with the company and the bureaus. And I would not speculate publicly about who signed anything because speculation is how people avoid accountability when documents exist. My father called within minutes and started with a soft voice that never lasts, telling me not to make something small into something big and not to embarrass the family by involving outsiders. And, because I know that tone is a hook, I let it swing by. Then I said that the only outsiders involved were the ones who had shipped new furniture to a place I had never lived and charged it to a name that was not theirs, after which I read the transaction log and the delivery note slowly enough that there was no room to pretend I was confused, and when he shifted to the classic argument about how family takes care of family, I agreed and said that I had done that for a long time, and that taking care of myself now was not an attack but a correction. And that corrections sometimes sound harsh when you have been off-key for years. My brother tried the camaraderie angle, sending me a string of messages about how stores mess up paperwork all the time and how he could drive over and return anything that might have shown up by mistake. Yet when I asked for a photo of the invoice that surely sat somewhere near the shiny new purchases, he told me not to turn this into a witch hunt and accused me of being obsessed with control, which would have been laughable if the vendor had not already emailed me the archived agreement with a signature box that looked like a child tracing letters in the wrong order and an authorization phone number that matched my parents' landline. So I replied once and said all of this was now in writing with the issuer, the bureaus, and my aunt holding copies. And any further conversation about money or credit or bills would stay in email for everyone's clarity. That should have been enough for a day. But the universe has a way of stitching patterns together when you finally stop pulling on the loose threads and just watch, because as I organized the digital receipts into a timeline for my own sanity, an old text surfaced from the spring I set up their internet service, the one where my mother asked me to read her a code over the phone because the installer needed to verify account ownership and she could not find her glasses, and when I compared the timestamp on that text to the account opening on the furniture card, the dates hugged each other like twins, which is when I stopped and sat very still, because beneath the noise and the guilt and the stories about who deserves what, a simple truth had been waiting. And it was about to change what I did next. When the first wave of angry texts failed to get the reaction they wanted, my father decided to switch strategies and called me directly. Using that familiar voice of strained patience he reserves for moments when he is trying to sound like the reasonable one in the room, and he told me that this whole situation could be solved if I would just stop acting dramatic and remember that family takes care of family, which he delivered with the kind of finality that was supposed to silence me, yet I sat there holding my phone against my ear and thought about how the definition of family in our house had been quietly rewritten over the years into something that looked a lot more like me paying and them taking. And it hit me how absurd it was that the one who covered the bills could still be called a burden by the very man whose mortgage stayed afloat because of my deposits. I told him, in one long breath that did not give him time to interrupt, that I had in fact been taking care of family for years, that I had covered every winter spike in heating costs, that I had added my brother's truck to my insurance policy when he claimed he could not afford the premiums, that I had topped up their mortgage whenever late fees were about to hit, and that I had done all of this quietly, without speeches or ultimatums, because I believed this was a temporary bridge they would eventually cross on their own. Yet the bridge had become a permanent highway paved with my paychecks, and when I finally dared to call it unsustainable, I was met with mockery instead of gratitude. He tried to brush it off with a chuckle that sounded more like gravel in his throat, and he said that they never asked me to do any of that, that I had volunteered, and I agreed with him on that point because volunteering is exactly how most exploitation begins. A hand raised once that becomes expected forever, and I explained that just because I had once chosen to help did not mean I had signed a lifetime contract to be their safety net, especially not for a brother who is still using my credit to prop up a truck he drove like a badge of independence, while the insurance quietly drained out of my account every month. The more I listed the facts, the more his voice hardened, because men like my father have built their entire identity on being the provider, the man of the house, the one who keeps the lights on and the mortgage paid. Yet here I was with receipts that showed I had been the one playing that role for years, and he knew that if I spoke it plainly enough, the myth of his authority would collapse in front of everyone, which is why he finally snapped and said I was trying to humiliate him, when the truth was that he had humiliated himself the moment he decided to call me a burden while dining on a meal I had effectively subsidized through a dozen invisible contributions. So I did something I had avoided for years because I knew the fallout it would cause. I called my insurance company, removed my brother as an authorized driver, canceled the supplemental coverage that existed only to protect his truck, and asked for written confirmation of the changes to be mailed to my new address. And when the agent asked if I wanted the effective date to be immediate or end of cycle, I told her immediate, because there is no reason to keep footing the bill for a man who thinks family obligation means one person sacrifices and everyone else coasts. Next, I printed certified letters addressed to both my parents and my brother, letters that politely but firmly outline the end of my financial entanglement, letters that contained reference numbers, cancellation confirmations, and explicit statements that I would not be liable for any late payments, repossessions, or defaults tied to accounts I had already removed my name from, and I mailed them at the post office with tracking slips I photographed and saved. Because if there is one thing I learned in this mess, it is that people who thrive on denial need to be confronted not with emotions, but with timestamps. When I got home, I sat at my desk and thought about how strange it felt to no longer carry the secret identity of the family's hidden provider, because for years I had believed that if I admitted out loud how much I covered, it would look like bragging or martyrdom. Yet now I understood it was the silence that kept me trapped. And in that silence, my father had been able to maintain the image of the strong patriarch while quietly leaning on me to hold up the pillars he claimed as his own. So by ending it, I was not just protecting my credit, I was dismantling a myth that had given him the power to sneer at me while spending the money I provided. And just when I thought I had tied off every loose end, my email pinged again with a notice from the credit bureau, this time alerting me to unusual activity on yet another account, an old store card tied to my social with a delivery address listed as customer residence, and the date on the account opening matched almost perfectly with the day I had helped my parents set up their internet service, which meant that someone had used my information during a moment of supposed convenience to quietly open a line of credit, and that realization hit harder than any insult, because it told me the problem was not just reliance, but misuse. And that is when I knew the next step would not be about family conversations at all, but about the kind of formal reports that create case numbers and file trails, because this was no longer only about boundaries. It was about ownership of my very identity. When the second credit alert arrived and confirmed that the account tied to my social security number was not just active, but had been used repeatedly over the past year, I realized there was no space left for family diplomacy or sentimental negotiations, because what had started as quiet financial dependence had now crossed into the territory of identity misuse. And once you cross that line, you cannot walk it back with apologies or excuses. You can only deal with it in the way the system requires, which is by creating a documented trail that does not bend under pressure, no matter how many emotional appeals are made to keep it private. I sat at my desk and pulled up the Federal Trade Commission's identity theft portal, filled out the affidavit with every detail the bank had sent me, noted the dates that lined up too neatly with family requests for help setting up accounts. And when I clicked submit and saw the confirmation page with a report number stamped across the top, I felt the kind of relief that comes not from revenge, but from finally treating your own life with the seriousness you should have years earlier. I called the credit bureau next, asked them to place an extended fraud alert, and listened as the representative explained the steps with a voice that was professional but carried a faint undertone of sympathy. The kind you only hear when the person on the other end of the line knows you are not the first victim they have spoken to today, and you will not be the last. And when she asked if I had suspects, I swallowed and told her that while I did, I would prefer to let the paperwork speak. Because naming family members over the phone felt like crossing a line I was not ready to make permanent, yet the evidence was already making the statement for me. Once the fraud alert was confirmed, I sent certified copies of the affidavit and report number to the card issuer with a clear letter stating that I was not responsible for any of the charges, and that all future correspondence should come to me in writing. Which might sound cold to some people, but when you have been gaslit for years into believing money disappears by accident, there is nothing colder than continuing to stay silent. My mother called me that evening, her voice trembling in that way she uses when she wants me to remember she is caught in the middle, and she begged me not to go nuclear, as she called it, because this would ruin the family's reputation. And neighbors might hear about it, and what would people think if police or investigators started asking questions? But I cut through her panic with a calm I did not even recognize in myself, and I told her I was not pressing charges. Not today. Not tomorrow. Not unless something escalated further. That I was simply protecting myself from being dragged into debt I did not create. And that my choice to treat this formally was not about hurting them, but about finally refusing to let my silence be used as cover for other people's choices. When my father found out I had filed reports, he stormed into my inbox with a chain of messages written in the kind of broken sentences that come from anger too fast to type properly, and each one alternated between telling me I was exaggerating, accusing me of betrayal, and reminding me that no real family drags outsiders into private matters. Yet I noticed he never once denied that the account existed, never once claimed ignorance of the purchases, and never once suggested he was blindsided, which told me everything I needed to know about where the truth really lived. My brother, for his part, tried a different angle, sending me a casual message with laughing emojis I refused to acknowledge, telling me that stores mess up paperwork all the time and that maybe I should calm down until the company figured it out. But when I forwarded him a copy of the delivery confirmation with his own apartment number stamped clearly on it, the line went silent, and I knew I had hit the core of his guilt. Aunt Marjorie, who had already been keeping copies of my documents, asked me directly whether I was ready to withstand the long freeze that would follow once the family realized I was no longer bluffing. And I told her that bluffing was the one thing I had finally quit, because for years my so-called boundaries were really just weak warnings I never enforced, and now I was enforcing them by putting the full weight of institutions behind me, which meant that the next time anyone tried to argue with me, they would be arguing with affidavits, case numbers, and certified letters instead of with my patience. I cannot overstate how different that felt, to know that every "you're overreacting" would bounce against documents instead of against my nerves, and for the first time I could breathe without feeling like I owed anyone an explanation for taking myself seriously. The final step that week was sending a blanket email to my parents and my brother with the subject line "Financial Boundaries Moving Forward," and in it I laid out, in plain English without threats or drama, that any contact regarding money, bills, accounts, or financial emergencies had to be submitted to me in writing by email, that I would not respond to phone calls or texts on those topics, and that I would only retain documentation for clarity and self-protection, and while I knew they would hate it, the truth is they had already forfeited their right to private negotiations the moment they decided to use my social without permission. I hit send, watched the message leave my outbox, and instead of dread, I felt a clean, grounded sense of closure, because now everything was out of the shadows, out of whispered agreements, and firmly in black and white. And when I sat down with Aunt Marjorie to go over the pile of paperwork and make sure every step had been filed correctly, she asked me one question I had been avoiding, which was whether I was prepared to walk away if my parents and my brother chose to cling to the story instead of the truth, whether I was willing to accept that they might decide protecting their image mattered more than repairing their relationship with me. And I surprised both of us when I answered without hesitation that, yes, I was ready, because at some point you stop asking yourself whether you can live with their anger, and you start asking whether you can live with yourself if you keep funding it, and for me that answer had finally become crystal clear. When the paperwork was finally filed, the credit freezes locked, the fraud alerts humming quietly in the background, and the certified letters signed for by the very people who had spent years pretending that I was overreacting, I knew I had reached the end of the line with them, not in the sense of some explosive disowning scene that would play out like a soap opera, but in the quiet and deliberate way someone reaches a decision that has been building in them for years, and I realized that my exit would only feel complete if it carried the same weight and precision as every step I had taken to untangle myself from their grip, which meant I had to leave on my own terms, not storming out, not begging to be understood, but closing the book in a way that left no open debts, no leverage, and no space for them to claim I had simply walked away in anger. I signed the lease for a small place across town, nothing extravagant, but mine in every sense, and while moving boxes on my own felt heavier than the weight of the objects inside them. The feeling of setting them down on a floor that no one else had access to was intoxicating, because it was the first time in years that I could look around and know every light, every bill, every square foot was mine and mine alone, untouched by the hidden strings of obligation or manipulation. In the weeks that followed, I packed quietly, shuttling my life piece by piece into the new apartment, not broadcasting it to the family group text, not explaining myself to anyone, because the time for explanations had long passed. And the only words left to offer were not explanations, but final statements that carried the clarity of an endpoint. When everything was ready, I asked Aunt Marjorie if I could use her living room as the setting for the last conversation, not because I wanted a stage, but because her presence served as the only form of accountability left in this family dynamic. The one person who had no stake in keeping lies alive and who would hold the silence steady if they tried to twist it back into noise. They came reluctantly, my father with that defensive posture of a man bracing himself for humiliation, my mother with her hands twisting as though she could wring guilt out of me if she just looked pained enough, and my brother with his usual mix of bravado and sulk, but I kept my tone level, my movements unhurried, and slid an envelope across the coffee table as though it were nothing more dramatic than a utility bill. Inside that envelope was a written release that stated, in simple terms, that I would no longer fund them under any circumstances, that every account, transfer, or arrangement previously tied to me had been canceled with confirmation numbers attached, and that I was not legally or financially responsible for any of their obligations moving forward, and I included copies of the official correspondence so that they could not argue ignorance. Alongside it, I placed a list of practical resources, numbers for debt counseling services, mortgage restructuring options, even a contact at a moving company that specialized in downsizing households, and, to ensure they could not say I had left them with nothing, I included a cashier's check made out directly to that moving service, covering exactly 1 day of professional help should they choose to cut back and relocate, because I wanted them to see that even in my exit, I was offering a final choice rooted in dignity rather than dependency. My father looked at the papers with his jaw clenched, his fork in midair moment replayed in another form, and for once, he had no words to fill the silence, because every number, every confirmation, every cancellation notice dismantled the story he had built about being the provider, and he could no longer hide behind the illusion that I was the one failing to carry my weight. My mother's eyes flickered with something between sadness and calculation, as if she were already considering how to spin this to relatives without admitting what the documents proved. And my brother smirked for a second before realizing the cashier's check wasn't cash in hand but a non-negotiable, practical tool that offered help only if he was willing to accept adult responsibility. I told them clearly that this was not up for discussion, that the folder was not an invitation to debate, but a record of closure, and that from this day forward, every decision they made would be theirs alone to carry, just as every decision I made would be mine. And for the first time in years, I felt the words leaving my mouth without that anxious tremor of, what if they get angry, because I no longer feared their anger more than I feared losing myself. I stood, thanked Aunt Marjorie for being there, and walked out without raising my voice or waiting for them to beg or curse, because dignity is not in the explosion, it is in the calm certainty that you have taken back what was stolen from you piece by piece. That night, in my new apartment, I set my phone on the counter, turned it to silent, and looked around at the stillness that felt foreign but deeply right, and I thought about how much of my life had been spent managing other people's chaos under the label of love, and how different it felt to sit inside a quiet that belonged only to me. For the first time, I understood that the real revenge was not in making them suffer but in proving, to myself more than anyone, that I could live without the strings, that I could break every rule they handed me about duty and loyalty and still come out stronger, freer, and entirely intact. And as I lay down that night, I realized the story had never been about whether they saw my worth. It had been about whether I was willing to live it myself, and in that moment the answer was finally, Irrevocably, yes.